On behalf of the Alliance for Children's Rights and California Coalition for Youth, welcome to our 2025 Virtual Policy Summit, The Path to Racial Equity, Addressing Disparities for Transition Age Youth and Child Welfare. I'm Alexis Martin with the Alliance for Children's Rights, and thank you for taking your time and willingness to share your expertise today to further the discussion of our report addressing issues related to policy and practice change that affect the livelihood, health, and well-being of transition-age youth in and exiting the child welfare system. We appreciate the time and dedication of the advocates, professionals, and policymakers gathered here today with a shared commitment to improving the lives of these young people. In 2021, the Alliance for Children's Rights published The Path to Racial Equity in Child Welfare, Valuing Family and Community, and in that report, we explored racial disproportionality and disparities in the child welfare system, the various policies and practice that have dictated, how children and families in foster care are treated, and the ways that permanency and reunification are achieved and supported. Children of color, and specifically Black and Native children, continue to experience disparities at every stage of the child welfare system. Maltreatment reports, investigations, case substantiations, service referrals, out-of-home placements, family reunification, termination of parental rights, and time spent in foster care. These disparities and disproportionalities compound as youth continue to be involved in the system, leading to disparate outcomes as they age into adulthood. The inequities young adults face in the system lead to adverse outcomes, including lower rates of educational attainment and higher rates of unemployment and poverty, homelessness, mental illness, incarceration, as well as premature death. Our report and this policy summit are intended to continue those conversations and recommendations to address racial disparities and disproportionalities in the child welfare system. So we're building on our initial report focused on entry into the system to examine the racial disparities and inequities transition age youth, those aged 16 to 24, experience while in and exiting the foster care system, and the ways in which those inequities are driven by systemic factors such as implicit bias, socioeconomic inequality, and inadequate access to culturally responsive services. We're making proactive and responsive recommendations for policy and practice changes to ameliorate those disparities. To focus our attention on this issue, please take a moment to answer the poll on your screen. So in 3 to 5 words, what do you think is the most critical and timely issue to address historic racial disparities for transition age youth in foster care? Your insights are valuable and will help guide today's discussion. So we'll give this about a minute or so. Once again, the poll asks in 3 to 5 words, what do you think is the most critical and timely issue to address historic racial disparities for transition age youth in foster care? Fifteen more seconds. So any last responses? Okay, we're now closing the poll. So the poll is now closed, and what I'm seeing based on the input, the most critical and timely issues identified are equitable housing, mental health access, economic stability, culturally responsive support and education equity, and these reflect the urgent needs in addressing historic racial disparities for transition age youth in foster care. So thank you so much for participating in that poll. Next slide, please. Our agenda is packed with listening and learning from our speakers and from all of you. And so we'll start with a listening and learning session with an expert who will share more about their experiences and their insights, urging us to address these inequities. And our listening and learning session will be facilitated by Sarah Rubin, our policy coordinator at the Alliance for Children's Rights, who will have a thoughtful conversation with Kalia McThyson. Then we'll be joined by Javon Wilkes, who's the Executive Director of the California Coalition for Youth, and to share more about bridging the gap between youth, systems, and community. For the past 14 years, Javon has mentored countless youth and served as a local and statewide advocate. He is a role model and champion for youth experiencing homelessness, youth disconnected from youth services, and youth in and exiting the foster care system. Javon's passion for serving vulnerable youth populations come from his lived experience with homelessness, the foster care system, and also being a disconnected youth. He is a member of the California Welfare Council and the Center for Family Finding, Engagement, and Support Advisory Council. We'll then walk through the 3 targeted themes from our policy recommendations, followed by breakout discussions during which you'll have the opportunity to provide your insights. And then we'll close the summit with next steps. So the targeted policy and practice reforms included in our report aim to combat the impacts of systemic disparities and disproportionalities and foster stability and expand economic and educational opportunities to improve the health and well-being of transition-age youth. Youth of color, particularly Black and Native youth, are disproportionately represented in California's foster care system, from their entry to their exit. This disproportionality reflects deeper systemic issues that demand our attention. These young people are often subjected to biases, misperceptions, and inequitable access to services, all of which compound the already difficult experience of growing up in care. And it is this disproportionate experience that contributes to poorer outcomes for many youth of color when compared to their peers. And we must acknowledge that these disparities are not just numbers on a page, right? They represent real lives, real futures. Transition-age youth often face a lack of tailored services, inadequate mental health supports, housing instability, as well as limited access to educational and employment opportunities. And they're often also viewed through a lens of deficit rather than as an individual with boundless potential and dreams of success. These perceptions of these young people is another challenge that we must address. Too frequently, they're seen as problems to be solved, right? Rather than youth to be supported. This negative framing impacts the resources that are allocated to them and the services designed to assist them. And as a result, many young people age out of the system without the necessary tools to succeed. Today, we're not just here to discuss the challenges, we're here to drive solutions. So to support transition-age youth, we need a system that is more equitable, one that recognizes their unique needs and actively work to remove the racial barriers that they face. This means improving access to quality education, stable housing, mental health care, and employment opportunities. It means recognizing resilience and strength of these youth and supporting them in building the futures that they deserve. In developing these recommendations, we spoke to young people and we heard that this is not an easy system to navigate, right? It's easy to forget that many youth who grew up in a 2-parent household still receive support as they complete high school and navigate the challenges and changes of transition to adulthood, including post-secondary education and career. So why should it be any different for our transition-age youth? We heard how difficult it is to navigate these systems as well as those perceptions. So this report was developed with the input from various community partners, engaging through listening sessions, surveys, interviews with youth with lived experience, parents, caregivers, service providers, state and local regulators, as well as other stakeholders. We heard that targeted policy and practice change can improve the experiences in foster care for those who disproportionately come to the attention of the child welfare system and have languished within that system. The information that we gathered, in combination with a literature review and interviews with other stakeholders, formed the basis of our recommendations. And so this report and summit would not be possible without the activism and advocacy of Black, Native American, and Latino youth who have been and continue to be disproportionately harmed by the child welfare system. youth in foster care are resilient and remarkable. So this quote that you see highlighted on the screen, it highlights the instability and systemic failures that contribute to distrust in adults and service providers for our transition age youth of color. The trauma of multiple placements, inconsistent caregivers, and systemic indifferences often leave youth feeling abandoned, unseen, and unsupported in meaningful ways. Healing from this is a process that requires intentional, I'll say that again, intentional and sustained efforts, not just from the youth themselves, but from the system and individuals who support them. The youth statement about lacking authentic support underscores a common frustration. Too often, the help provided is procedural rather than personal. And many youth in foster care feel they encounter professionals who engage with them out of obligation rather than genuine care, leading to skepticism about whether support is truly in their best interest or simply a means to fulfill contractual or bureaucratic requirements. Authentic support is relational, consistent, and built on trust, where the young person feels valued beyond their status as a client or a case number. And we will explore this notion with our expert with lived experience. This youth statement is a powerful reflection of the need for a fundamental shift in how we approach support for transition age youth. Ensuring that assistance is truly youth-centered, consistent, and built on trust is essential for empowering them to heal and thrive. To hear more from the youth perspective, please welcome Kalia and Sarah Rubin.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hi, Kalia. Thank you so
Hi,
much.
Kalia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. We prioritize listening to youth with lived experience in our initial research phase to assist us in developing the recommendations we'll delve into a bit later. We learn from youth with recent experience with the foster care system that significant barriers exist in accessing housing and education and critical services and supports, including health and behavioral health support, and particularly more specialized supports for expectant and parenting youth and those victimized by commercial sexual exploitation, as well as achieving permanency. These findings should not be a surprise to anyone here as you draw on your own experiences and conversations with transition age youth. As you know, disparities and disproportionalities begin prior to entry into the system and can be exacerbated as youth age in the system or are exiting system or enter foster care as a youth. We're thrilled that Kalia has joined us as an expert with experience in the child welfare system to share her insights, experiences, and recommendations for policy and practice change strategies that will enhance support for older youth in the foster care system, particularly Black and Native American youth. Kalia Matthijssen was born in Los Angeles, where she developed a passion for advocacy, policy change, and community engagement. From a young age, she demonstrated a keen interest in leadership, education, and social justice, which set the foundation for her future pursuits. Kalia attended UC Irvine, where she excelled academically and participated in various extracurricular activities, including mentoring, becoming a young leader with the LAOYC, and becoming a member of her school's mock trial club. Kalia is a dedicated and passionate individual whose journey has been marked by achievements, service, and commitment to making a positive impact in her community. As she continues to grow and evolve, there is no doubt that she will leave a lasting legacy in her field and beyond. So thank you so much for joining us, Kalia.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that beautiful introduction. And again, thank you for having me.
Of course. So we're going to start with the first question today. So our focus is on addressing racial disproportionality and disparity in the child welfare system related to transition age youth and on concrete, actionable recommendations that will result in improvements to policy and practice. In your experience, what do you think is the most significant barrier for transition age youth in achieving their goals?
Right, great question. One of the most significant barriers for transition age youth is the absence of a stable and supportive network. When we age out of care, we are often entering into adulthood without the necessary guidance or resources to navigate crucial areas such as education, career, development. not because we lack ambition or we lack the capability, but because we simply have not been given the tools or the knowledge to pursue better opportunities. This lack of foundational support can lead to a cycle of poverty and unfulfilled potential, which leaves us struggling without any direction.
Thank you, Kalia. We'll now go to the second question, which is if you could change one thing about your experience in the child welfare system, what would it be and why?
One change in the system that I would make, it would be the overwhelming lack of guidance. When it came to educational guidance and resources, I often felt lost and confused about how to apply for resources such as financial aid or discovering housing opportunities. It's not just about having access to the information, it's about having someone, an advocate, someone who can genuinely show up and who genuinely cares and can help you navigate these complex situations and these complex systems.
Thank you. We'll move on to our third question, which is, did you face any barriers in accessing supportive services like mental health services, education, or employment opportunities while you were in care? And would you describe those barriers as access, meaning you had difficulty accessing the supportive services you needed to achieve your goals, or you didn't think the resources available met your needs?
Right. So, yes, I have faced a lot of barriers in accessing supportive services while in care and while I was aged out of care. Um, One challenge in particular was finding stable housing, often leaving me in and out of shelters, which created an unstable environment for myself and in turn for my child. It wasn't until I took the initiative to attend workshops at my local community college that I learned about crucial resources like the Chafee Grant, scholarships. Um, this lack of awareness is a systematic issue that needs addressing. Transition age youth must be informed about available resources as early as possible. And again, going back to question 2, it's not just about telling us about the resources. Um, it's about helping us navigate them and giving us the knowledge that we need to achieve our goals.
Thanks so much, Clea. We'll go to the next question. Question 4 asks, please describe a time when you felt empowered by the system. Who or what made a difference and why?
Right. A pivotal moment of empowerment for me came when I was aged out of the foster care system, and my former probation officer wrote me a very heartwarming letter of recommendation. Just this simple act of belief in my potential had a profound impact on my life. It definitely showed me that someone believed in my dreams, which helped fuel my determination to succeed against the odds stacked against me.
Thank you. The next question is, please tell us about a time when you felt disengaged or disempowered by the system. What would have made a difference in that situation?
Right. I felt deeply disempowered when my aspirations of attending college were dismissed by my then social worker and counselor. I was around 16 at the time, and I believe I was in 10th grade or 11th. They were very dismissive and told me, you're just a kid. You don't need to worry about things like that. You have plenty of time. I'm sorry, my connection.
Nice.
This dismissive attitude made me feel invisible. And instead of engaging in a meaningful conversation about what my educational goals were, I felt overlooked and just disempowered about what my choice would be for the future.
Thank you for sharing that. Our next question is, how has your experience in the system influenced your views on relationships, trust, and community? And what changes would help transition age youth foster healthier connections with others?
Right. My experience in foster care has had a significant impact on my views on relationships, trust, community. Um, Growing up, I felt very isolated. Um, and now that I am an adult, I've learned that a supportive community is vital for healing and for growth. Transition age youth, particularly, need structured opportunities to foster healthy relationships, such as peer mentorship programs, building a genuine and supportive network. Um, these are just some things that can help combat that loneliness and that disconnection many of us feel. This gives us an opportunity to develop trust and build meaningful connections that can potentially last a lifetime.
Thank you, Kalia. I really want to emphasize what you said about supportive community and trust and what we're trying to build and how that really impacted your life positively.
Right.
So our next question is, what role do you think youth voices should play in shaping the policies and practices of the child welfare system? And how would you want to be involved in policy and practice change?
Right. Great question. I feel youth voices must be at the forefront of shaping policies and practices within the child welfare system. Our lived experiences provide essential insights that can drive meaningful and effective change. Um, Myself, I want to actively be involved in advocacy efforts that amplify youth perspectives and that ensure we are included in the decision-making processes. Our voices matter, and we should definitely have a seat at the table when it comes to shaping the system that is meant to support us.
I 100% agree with that. Of course, those with lived experience have the most important voice because of their experience, and we're hoping we can uplift that today. So our next question is, now thinking big, what is one big change you would suggest to improve the child welfare system for transition age youth?
My favorite question. um, One change that I would like to see um, is to establish a robust advocacy framework that includes youth voices in every level of decision making within the child welfare system. This would not only validate our experiences, but it would also empower us to take an active role in shaping the policies and practices that affect our lives. By fostering this culture of collaboration and inclusiveness, we can create a system that truly supports and uplifts transition age youth.
Thank you so much, Kalia. That's all the questions we had planned to discuss today. We so greatly appreciate you speaking with us. It means so much. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Okay. I am now going to introduce Javon Wilkes with California Coalition for Youth.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Kalia, for just sharing your aspirations and what you see to be changed with a big smile on your face. Because the truth is, it is possible. And I've been blessed to be a living example of that. And so, everyone, I like to just really think about this statement of it's not the young people's fault, but it will be their problem to solve. And they are in most proximity to the problem as much, if not more, to the solution. Hi, everybody. I'm Javon Wilkes. I'm the executive director with the California Coalition for Youth. I've been with the agency now for little over 2 decades, 7 years as the executive director, but started as a youth. And when it comes to this opportunity we have now to actually act on recommendations that have the youth involved and what recommendations they know to better their lives, but also the generations that come after. So, next slide. The California Coalition for Youth, we've been around for over 40 years, almost over 45 years now, and our whole mission is to improve and empower the lives of California's youth with a focus on youth experiencing homelessness, disconnection, and instability. Next slide. One way in which we do that is through the California Youth Crisis Line, which we have operated for over, you see since 1986, and that's over 36, maybe 38 years. Don't got the math buzz going because I got the speaking bug going, but we've done that, and we have over 100 volunteers who do have lived experience, who do have aspirations to join the behavioral health workforce. Next slide. And with that, another component as to how we do our work to improve and empower the lives of youth, especially our most vulnerable youth, is through our Youth Empowerment Summit. We do public policy and advocacy work, and we do that with members across the state of California. And when it comes to this day, which is coming up this Sunday, March 2nd through the 4th, we will not only come together to learn, play, and heal, because one of the things that our young people that have endured system involvement and homelessness and instability is that they have to grow up and become adults before they even reach the age in which they can sign off on things as an adult. I hope y'all can let that sink in as well. Again, young people, especially those in the foster care system, have to grow up and be adults before they're even adults. And so we get to have young people come out to Sacramento, the Embassy Suites, have them engage in workshop, engage in knowledge, engage in keynotes, engage with our elected officials who would go there, but also the young people get to experience what advocacy looked like when you're going to the Capitol, speaking to elected officials and their staffers on things that is going to not only impact their lives, but impact the lives of their peers. Next slide. And so that's how we do this work. This is the photo taken actually during our advocacy day for youth experiencing homelessness. And this was some years ago. Again, I've been with the agency for quite some time now. Next slide. So as you heard from Kalia, youth must be engaged, empowered, and elevated. Kalia has been engaged, as you can see, through just being here and being present, but we need more of that when it comes to the youth who are impacted by the systems. They must be empowered, especially with the knowledge, the tools, but the human capital. They need people to support them so that they can rise and elevate to be the change. Next slide. And as you can see, young people are also smiling and looking forward to the day that that change comes. They are still hopeful, even in the climate that they have to grow up in from birth until today. Next slide. And so when it comes to the systems, these recommendations, everything you will be hearing today is meant to protect those young people, to protect our future, to involve them in protecting our future, but really making sure that the systems evolve to meet the needs of the young people at this time and for, again, generations to come and those generations that have passed. Next slide. And so we need everybody to step up, y'all. This is not a time to sit on the sidelines. This is maybe more so a time to reflect on how you gonna show up. Because the truth, lip service can only go so far. But action is what inspires and builds that fire in young people to stay engaged, to preserve their life and the lives of their peers. This work is not just for them. And it's also not just for the young people, it's also for the adults, because there's some adults that still act like kids, but it's really for the adults who are ready to take on the actions in which the young people need them to take on. And so, next slide. When we're thinking about how we're going to do that, we got to do it in community. And that means we all going to be learning sometimes at a speed of light. And then we have to make sure that not only are we building trust, but we are holding ourselves to high integrity when it comes to keeping that trust, because from that, the most important thing that we do not talk about as we should, which is loving our youth and loving each other in ways that make youth engaged, that makes the system say we have to submit to what they need, because it's from a strong standpoint of community, especially that's built on love. Next slide. So with that, these are the faces of the young people. And guess what? There's more. And we have the ability and the power to make sure that their lives have something to look forward to, contain that hope that they have in their hearts to show up, and so that they can love on community and make sure that their voices, their leadership is in prime posture to make the changes, because again, they are in proximity to the solution. Next slide. And now I hand it back over to the team and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today. I hope that this inspires you, and I hope a fire is lit under you as well, because this work is serious again, now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Javon, and thank you for starting to light the fire. We so appreciate the work that you and the California Coalition for Youth do to engage, empower, and elevate our young people. And we want to especially, again, appreciate Kalia for sharing her insights and her experiences to help us really see the value of analyzing what has gone before and where we need to go next. So that takes us to our policy practice reform recommendations. I'm Kristen Power with the Alliance for Children's Rights. And we've been listening to youth, caregivers, providers, advocates, and agency representatives to identify key themes for our report supporting their journey, the path to racial equity and child welfare for transition-aged youth, where changes to policy and practice would significantly improve the lives of transition-aged youth, particularly those who've historically been marginalized by the child welfare community. These recommendations address systemic racial disparities, successful transitions to adulthood, housing stability, educational attainment and career supports, behavioral health access, and more. Before we want to walk through the recommendations, I want to reiterate that our intent today is to identify actionable recommendations that proactively address critical issues, acknowledging the hard day-to-day work that social workers, probation officers, service providers, minors and parents council, advocates, and all other adult supporters, including caregivers, mentors, and CASA, are engaged in to support the needs of and the goals of our transition-aged youth. that the Alliance and other advocacy groups and systems and partners can implement. These recommendations are a blueprint for our collective action, as Javon just lit the fire to start us thinking about. We have over 10 years of experience with extended foster care in California, and we know that our transition age youth are not only experiencing a different world than the one that most of us grew up in, it's a different world than when extended foster care was created. For example, you all were in theaters in 2010 watching Toy Story 3 when AB 12, the extended foster care statute, passed, and Instagram was created that year. Just 2 years after Apple released the iPhone 4. In the years since, we've experienced a global pandemic and a housing crisis that is only escalating. The good news is that we have also collectively stepped up for transition age youth with supports like extended foster care and the Family Urgent Response System. These recommendations we'll discuss today and in the report will continue in that vein, supporting youth in their journeys. We identified 7 key themes and 58 recommendations, advancing policy and practice reform from our conversations and research, broadly addressing racial disproportionalities and disparities and supporting successful transitions to adulthood. Notably, we identified housing, concrete supports, preventing food insecurity, attaining educational goals, and ensuring timely access to behavioral health services, addressing permanency disruptions, and rethinking permanency options and targeted supports for our expectant and parenting youth and youth victimized by commercial sexual exploitation as key themes. Today, we'll be talking about 3 of these key themes: addressing system-wide racial disproportionalities and disparities, providing housing stability and preventing exits to homelessness, and addressing permanency disruptions and permanency options to avoid instability. We encourage you to read the whole report and learn more about the policy recommendations not covered in today's presentation and discussions. As we begin, it's important to recognize the systemic racial disproportionalities and disparities that exist in the child welfare system. As Alexis mentioned, historically, children of color have been disproportionately represented at every stage, from initial entry into the system to permanency outcomes. These disparities are deeply rooted in systemic bias, socioeconomic inequality, and a lack of culturally responsive services and supports. Our first set of recommendations is aimed at dismantling these inequities, ensuring that all children and families, regardless of race or ethnicity, are treated fairly and equitably. Our first recommendation under the key theme of addressing systemic racial disproportionalities and disparities is to develop recruitment and retention supports to help ensure the child welfare workforce understands the child welfare population and have insight from lived experience. Child welfare practitioners engage in very complex work, investigating reports of abuse and neglect, developing child and family case plans, and helping make recommendations to the court. It is important to understand these racial and cultural disparities to understand the realities faced by children, youth, and families in the child welfare system, and to prioritize individuals with lived experience, either as former foster youth, parents with systems involvement, or professionals who work directly with vulnerable populations who are reflective of and understand their communities. Furthermore, retraining a well-trained, motivated workforce is crucial, as high turnover rates can disrupt services and negatively impact outcomes for children and families. Our next recommendation is creating and disseminating training and other supports for those with lived experience working with children and youth in and exiting the child welfare system to assist in addressing relived trauma through their employment. We heard from child welfare practitioners with lived experience that they use their unique perspectives and insights to help serve children and families. These experts help with enhancing practices and engagement with youth and families as social workers, mentors, peer supporters, advocates, and CASAs. They sometimes experience triggers when they work with children and youth and families of similar backgrounds. Better support systems need to be established, combined with comprehensive training to foster a workforce that can deliver trauma-informed, culturally responsive, and equitable services. Counties may experience challenges in addressing and assessing disproportionality in their services and systems. Counties may not be focused and utilizing tools for that purpose. such as the disproportionality diagnostic tool, a tool created to enable organizations to understand the underlying issues of disproportionality and the contributing factors. Addressing disproportionality requires a data-driven approach to assess gaps in services and delivery of those services, areas of bias, and system inefficiencies that contribute to disparities. The tool would enable counties to analyze racial and ethnic disproportionalities at key decision points in the child welfare process, such as reporting, investigating, removal, placement, and permanency outcomes. Utilizing this tool will also help identify trends and patterns in disproportionality by examining data over time and across various subpopulations. Our next recommendation is to direct the California Department of Social Services, which I'll call CDSS, with stakeholders' input to improve data collection related to reports of neglect. CDSS publishes reports on child fatalities, near fatalities, and cases of neglect. County child welfare agencies submit data collected on a statement of findings and information form to CDSS quarterly. However, the current data collection process and reporting of neglect cases are often fragmented, outdated, or incomplete, making it difficult to analyze trends, identify systemic biases, or track the effectiveness of those interventions. The lack of comprehensive and disaggregated data on neglect reports poses significant challenges in understanding the underlying causes of neglect and in developing targeted interventions that address the needs of vulnerable families. Recommendation 5 is developing system capacity in CWS CARES, that is the tracking system, to systemically track the reason a maltreatment report does not meet the criteria for referral for child welfare, to help develop a better understanding of why older youth, including unaccompanied youth and youth in homeless families, have higher rates of reports being evaluated out. The goal of child abuse and neglect data tracking is to collect, analyze, and interpret data to inform a more effective response in child maltreatment. Children of color are often treated as more mature than their white counterparts and must face the stresses of racial biases from a young age. This is particularly alarming because older youth and those experiencing homelessness are among the most vulnerable populations, often facing higher risks of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Despite these risks, reports of maltreatment concerning these groups are frequently dismissed or not referred for further action, leaving gaps in protection and services for young people. Recommendation 6 is to develop system capacity in CWS CARES to collect data on self-petitions from youth for court dependency under Welfare and Institutions Code sections 329 and 331, as well as the outcomes of those petitions, to better understand whether older youth experience relative challenges gaining access to foster care, even if their rate of entry into foster care following substantiation of maltreatment is equivalent to rates for younger youth. In March of 2019, the California Legislative Analyst's Office published a report that first reviewed the maltreatment substantiation rates between younger youth and older youth. Although rates were lower for older youth, the gap appeared to be the result of two differences. One, maltreatment reports for older youth were determined to not require an in-person investigation at higher rates than for younger youth. And two, fewer maltreatment reports for older youth were determined to be substantiated following in-person investigations for younger youth. Despite these differences, older and younger youth have largely equivalent rates of entry into foster care following a maltreatment substantiation. CWS CARES does not collect comprehensive information on the frequency of self-petitions for court dependency or track the outcomes of those petitions. Without this data, it's difficult to assess whether older youth face unique challenges in accessing foster care compared to younger children, despite having equivalent rates of substantiated maltreatment. This knowledge gap limits the ability to create targeted interventions and reforms to support older youth in accessing the supports and services of foster care and extended foster care. Recommendation 7 is to develop system capacity in CWS CARES to collect data on whether reports related to maltreatment are self-reported by transition-age youth or reported by someone else, to provide insight into whether older and younger youth are treated differently when they self-report maltreatment rather than when it is reported by others, including service providers. Youth with lived experience reported on their perceived treatment from child welfare practitioners in our focus groups and interviews, including their feelings about how staff interacted and engaged with them from entry to exit. Many noted they believed the way they were treated by their social workers or their child welfare staff who engaged with them was based on physical or phenotypical characteristics and their socioeconomic status. As well, there was a perception that older youth of color may be perceived as more mature or capable and therefore may not be evaluated in for a child welfare referral. Recommendation 8 is to monitor outcomes for youth with prior reports of abuse and neglect for safety, permanency, and well-being. Youth with prior reports of abuse and neglect are more vulnerable to disparate outcomes. Therefore, data on the outcomes of prior reports, as well as the most recent report for youth with a history of multiple reports, may help determine whether certain youth have had more difficulty gaining access to foster care supports over time and to support additional reforms. Our next key theme is providing housing stability and preventing exits to homelessness. You heard Kalia earlier talk about how important housing stability is for our youth in care and those exiting care. Housing stability is a critical foundation for success, yet youth aging out of the foster care system face a significant risk of homelessness. Without stable housing, their ability to maintain employment, pursue education, or focus on their health and well-being is severely compromised. These recommendations focus on improving access to transitional and long-term housing options, streamlining housing processes, and preventing exits to homelessness. By addressing these needs, we can help youth secure the stable homes they need to build their successful futures. The first recommendation is prevent youth experiencing homelessness while in care by building systems capacity and removing artificial barriers to housing entry. Available beds often fill up very quickly for the year, and programs cannot accommodate the number of transition-aged youth looking for housing. Additional transitional housing is needed in communities that are safe and convenient to education and work opportunities, with a staged transition from more supported to more independent housing. As you all know, youth can experience housing instability like couch surfing, a homelessness, as they are waiting for caseworkers to approve their supervised independent living placement or SILP. Many workers are inundated with high caseloads and are unable to approve SILPs in a timely way. The implementation of a more streamlined process for SILP placements will help workers approve placements in time to allow youth to seamlessly transition into SILPs without experiencing homelessness instability or housing instability. The second recommendation is to promote a true housing continuum for our transition, reimagining the housing options. Transitional housing was intended to allow youth to move from a more structured, supportive housing environment to a more independent option. However, the lack of supportive housing and supported transitional housing, including transitional housing with appropriate mental or behavioral health supports, limits participation in more supportive housing. Reimagining the housing continuum and redesigning programs to meet the needs of young adults could reduce the reliance on SILPs and support youth transitions. Recommendation 3 is to maximize access to and the use of the Foster Youth to Independence or FYI housing vouchers. Youth exiting foster care may experience housing instability and homelessness as a result of the competitive rental market and their lack of rental history. As well, landlords might be unfamiliar with FYI vouchers or reluctant to participate in the program. Counties should leverage the Chafee foster care program for successful transition to adulthood and housing navigation and maintenance funding, build relationships with their community landlords, and establish a strong working relationship between the county welfare agencies, public housing authorities, and community-based organizations to maximize access and use of these FYI vouchers. Recommendation 4 is prevent involuntary exits from transitional housing placement non-minor dependent or THP NMD programs due to the youth's inability to fulfill program requirements. Involuntary exits from these programs resulting from an inability to fulfill those program requirements can lead to housing instability and homelessness and disruptions to the transition to adulthood. Programs should prioritize creating flexible and supportive approaches that address the underlying reasons for the youth's noncompliance. Additionally, programs should focus on remediation rather than punitive measures, offering tailored interventions and additional support for youth struggling to meet the program requirements. Recommendation 5 is ensure continuity of support and prevent instability, particularly in times of transition, by uncoupling the stipends that are particularly focused on young people, including infant supplement and clothing allowances, and the AFDC-FC monthly payments, also known as the foster care payment, from the placement. When placements change or are disrupted, youth may lose access to these very essential financial supports, leaving them vulnerable to financial insecurity and basic needs gaps. To address this, we're recommending uncoupling these stipends and payments from placement, ensuring continuity of financial support regardless of the youth's housing situation. This recommendation ensures that youth are not penalized financially due to circumstances that are out of their control, ultimately fostering better outcomes for their transition to adulthood. Recommendation 6 is to provide training, technical assistance, and resources and information to the Family Urgent Response System statewide hotline staff to address calls from current and former foster youth related to housing instability and homelessness. We recommend providing targeted training, technical assistance, and resources to the FERS staff to ensure they're equipped to handle calls related to housing instability and homelessness for transition-age youth. Developing a continually updated directory with community-level resources can be used by the FERS staff to help transition-age youth access housing placements in an emergency, or even as they are transitioning between placements. Recommendation 7 is encourage development in partnership with youth of a comprehensive housing plan through the required development and updating of their Transitional Independent Living Plan, or TILP, to address changing needs as they age and progress in achieving their goals, and ensuring the plan is reflective of practical and specific goals. The housing plan should include short and long-term goals, such as securing transitional housing, applying for housing subsidies like the FYI or FUP vouchers, and encouraging and exploring permanent housing options. It should also identify specific steps and resources to achieve these goals, such as connecting to housing navigators, attending financial literacy workshops, and building youth rental history. By encouraging this proactive and youth-centered approach, we can ensure that housing plans are not just documents, but living strategies that evolve with the youth. This will help prevent housing crises and foster stability, giving youth more foundation as they transition to adulthood, giving them more agency in their plans, and helping them to pursue their goals. Recommendation 8 is to ensure counties provide on-demand access to housing and other supportive services. On-demand access means creating systems where youth can quickly connect to emergency and transitional housing without unnecessary delays or barriers. This involves maintaining an inventory of available housing resources, including emergency shelters, transitional housing programs, and long-term housing options, and streamlining referral processes so youth can access these services immediately. This approach ensures that young people in care have a safety net that empowers them to overcome challenges. Recommendation 9 is to provide training and technical assistance to counties, housing providers, and housing navigators to prevent exclusionary or discriminatory practices from destabilizing housing security and to promote successful housing transitions. This training should focus on identifying and addressing biases that may lead to discriminatory treatment, including stereotypical attitudes or stereotypes about youth in foster care, cultural or racial biases, and assumptions about behavior or financial responsibility. Additionally, training should promote trauma-informed and youth-centered approaches that emphasize understanding and empathy for the challenges youth in foster care and exiting foster care face. How are y'all doing out there? Thinking? Absorbing it all? Getting it all in? Excellent, because we've got one more to go. The next key theme is preventing permanency disruptions and supporting permanency options to avoid instability. Achieving permanency, whether through reunification, adoption, or guardianship, is the ultimate goal for children in foster care, but it remains elusive for many of our youth, especially those who are older. The disruption of permanency or lack of stable long-term placements can lead to instability in every area of a young person's life. These recommendations focus on reducing disruptions to permanency and creating more stable, supportive environments to youth, ensuring they have a consistent place to call home, both while in care and beyond. Permanency typically refers to finding a stable long-term home through adoption, guardianship, or reunification with family. However, as transition age youth approach adulthood, traditional forms of permanency may not always be the best fit. That's why we recommend expanding the range of permanency options available to include relational permanency. Relational permanency focuses on establishing enduring supportive relationships with trusted adults, even when legal permanency, such as adoption or guardianship, is not achieved. These relationships are key to providing emotional and social stability for youth as they age out of foster care. Relational permanency could involve connections with mentors, teachers, extended family members, or other trusted individuals who can provide ongoing guidance, support, and a sense of belonging as youth navigate their path to adulthood. Think about it as a youth's board of directors. Our next recommendation is to amend Welfare and Institutions Code Section 388.1 to remove the requirement that youth must prove that funding has terminated before they can re-enter extended foster care. This change would allow former foster youth whose adoption or guardianship disrupts to petition the court to re-enter extended foster care immediately without having to navigate the complex and time-consuming process of confirming the end of financial support from their adoptive or guardianship parent. By eliminating this barrier, we can ensure that youth facing a disrupted adoption or guardianship do not experience gaps in care or in support. So that was fast, right? Now imagine, I just went through about, 20 or so, 25. There are 58 in total. So this is just a snapshot. But before we talk about these key themes that we're going to dive into next in a breakout, I just want to remind everyone, these are supposed to be actionable solutions, things that we can take action to address instability immediately. While engaging in the conversations, please consider implications for racial disparities and inequities in the experiences of our transition age youth, and offer your expertise and insight to inform the further development of our holistic policy reform agenda. We'll have facilitators in the breakout rooms. Please select an individual from your breakout room to share your insights at the close of the discussion, including any actionable items or insights that emerged from the group. Should you need any assistance in the breakout rooms while you're away from us, please let us know. Once you're finished, and no later than 11:25, so facilitators, I'm giving you 25 minutes, please return to the main Zoom room so we can learn from each other and continue our conversations. Everybody ready? Got your thinking and sharing hats on? This is where I turn from policy advocate to primary school teacher, apparently. I don't know. These things happen. All right.
Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you had meaningful conversations in the breakout sessions. And so before we continue, please just take a moment to answer the next poll. What resonated most for you in the recommendations? And once again, your feedback is crucial as we work together towards impactful policy solutions. So please take about a minute or so to answer that question. Once again, if you're joining with us, what resonated most with you through the recommendations, and answer that in the poll. And we'll get back to our feedback portion in a second. All right, 30 more seconds. Oh, cool. So seeing here your feedback that highlighted that the most resident recommendations focus on ensuring housing stability, strengthening cross-system collaboration, expanding mental health access, as well as enhancing supports for EPY, expectant and parenting youth. I think I agree to all of that. I think these priorities align with the urgent needs for transition age youth and reinforce the importance of targeted systemic action. So absolutely, thank you so much for partaking in the poll question as well as the discussion portion, and I will pass it over to Kristen.
Well, again, thank you for participating in the breakout group discussion. I'm sure you had some insightful conversations, and we would like to get a little insight into what you all discussed. So Sarah, I think you'll work with me on unmuting folks, or if folks may be able to unmute themselves. So group one, tell us what insights came from your discussion. What did you all talk about? What would you like to share?
I suppose I'm not sure, who should step up here, but I'll just go ahead and share some of the stuff that came up around addressing system-wide racial disproportionalities and disparities. So the questions were around practice changes for certain scenarios of bias that kids may face. In this case, in the scenario we were focused on was for with social workers specifically, and we identified, obviously these relationships are very complex, but we questioned, what is the changing landscape of competency trainings has been evolving for years. How can we take another step on improving in that? We had some dialogue around, what forms of additional support may we be able to offer kids in terms of mentorship to help navigate those kinds of circumstances so that they can have somebody in their corner supporting them, not only in situations where they experience sort of bias or may feel disempowered or rejected in some way, but also to navigate just the complexities of growing up and dealing with more and more sort of barriers and responsibilities and obligations. And then finally, we had some conversation about how difficult it actually is to measure accountability in the system. And the reason for that, when you're looking at bias, one, like by itself, we don't want to, one of our group members had shared, who does data research, we don't want to, overemphasize the quantitative numerical values of certain people's experience, and qualitative information is really useful, gathering the story, the experience of the person. And so one of the challenges of that is if there is bias in the system, and often you may see in some of these cases that the folks that are participating in that bias, if you will, or perpetuating it, are often reporting the same issues. And so it's a complex and difficult issue being able to flesh out the experiences if we don't do what Kalia had mentioned in the introduction and her remarks, putting youth with lived experiences in every stage of the decision-making process and accountability process, so that you're continuing to guide by a set of principles where the youth's experience, even if complicated, we know, young people, and I was one once too, can be, difficult in some situations, not to blame them, but it happens. And so, but you need people in your corner still, nonetheless. So, it's valuable putting up that lived experience, adding validity to it. That's some of the stuff that came up in our conversation.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Zachariah. Anyone else in the group want to come off mute and share? All right, we'll look forward to your feedback through your notes on the Padlet, and also any communications you want to share post virtual summit. Group two, what were your major takeaways?
I can go ahead and kind of speaker relay for group two. We had a really robust discussion, so I don't know that I'll have time to read all of them, but some of the ones that are posted on the Padlet are that accountability needs to be written into policy so that it carries the weight of rights. introducing social workers or youth-facing workers to different cultures that exist within our community to help them to understand what Black and Latino cultures actually are and what they foster in real life. Help these workers get a firsthand, meaningful sense of what different cultures' expressions of community can look like. Cultural competency training for social workers should be mandatory and should be ongoing. And they should have a multitude of scenarios that can affect the social workers themselves and really how they feel. Social workers need to address their biases. Resource parents are taught cultural humility, and some do not understand how culture can shape a youth and how their culture influences how they parent or serve. Policy changes. High on the top of the list is establishing youth voices at every level of the child welfare system, explaining exactly where this participation is needed to impact policy, identify if there's low-hanging fruit. So really putting it within the power of the youth that we're seeking or eliciting input from to control and direct their messaging to really be able to be enacted or operationalized by decision makers by providing background and contextual information about the opportunity to provide feedback, as well as providing maybe advice or recommendations for changes that would be relatively uncomplicated or maybe less complicated to make. And accountability and culture in a workplace go hand in hand. If one person is holding everyone accountable, the work can be exhausting for that one person. It's important that at every level of the organization, there's management and others checking each other on how our biases are coming into play. So really creating an organization-wide culture of accountability. Cultural competency trainings to help us identify ourselves, how our brains have been socialized into biases. In this case, calling a client defiant and difficult are racialized terms that are often assigned to Black and Brown clients. So that's just a little bit of a preview. Feel free to peruse our Padlet page for the full picture.
Sounds like a very intensive and deep conversation that y'all had in group 2. Thank you. Anyone else in group 2 would like to share some thoughts?
I would like to add two things, which are identifying new partners who've had success in our areas, like the Downtown Women's Center and housing, maybe working with them, and also identifying if there's anything we can identify that works in the system that we want to replicate, have some positive feedback on and understanding of what works. And the example I gave was the Seed School, which has places for our youth to board at the school. That might be a practice that we would want to replicate. I don't know, but I would like to know what, if anything, works and how do we replicate it?
Elevating best practices and sharing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and new partnerships.
And new partnerships. Yes, thank you. Any others like to share? Right, group 3. What did you all discuss?
I can share out. First, I just want to say thank you to our entire discussion group. I feel like we had a really good conversation. So we just really focused on accountability, really, and training that needs to be happening for social workers and caregivers, to really enforce them to have a better understanding of what youth are going through and how they really need to listen to their needs and their wants. We also talked about maybe doing like a yearly refresher on those types of things, like culture competency trainings, like something that is a reminder for them to understand their training and making sure that they're also taking accountability for these trainings and not just doing the trainings. Alexis highlighted that, we can have all these trainings, but we're not sure that they can actually implement this too when they're helping their youth. We also talked about, we had scenario 3, and we were talking about just reinsurance, making sure that adults are also being held accountable when youth are aging out from the foster care system, and making sure that they are unable to receive funds if they're still like receiving these funds, maybe some like written accountability, some type of contract. Also, that if adults are receiving these funds, that like putting them on a payment plan to make sure that they're paying the youth back for the resources that they're being used, that the youth are being out and left on the street and unprepared for adulthood, so that the adult that are taking advantage of these situations can repay the youth that they are taking advantage of. So we kind of went into conversation about that, and also creating an assistance program for youth. So maybe the youth have an organization to reach out to make sure that they have more assistance that maybe the caregivers no longer want to give to them, or if they're in lack of resources. But we really just talked about preventative things that we can do and hold both parties accountable, but more on the adult side, and making sure that we're continuing to address just measures that are helping the youth succeed in adulthood.
Thanks, Denise. I really like that idea about accountability, and that seemed to be a theme in all 3 of the groups. And you were really focusing there on accountability for in permanency, to ensure that resources are actually being given and supportive to the young person, rather than not reaching them to meet their needs. Anyone else in group 3 like to share their thoughts? All right. Well, thank you all again. Appreciate your thoughtful insights, your conversation, engaging deeply with the recommendations, and engaging more holistically around how we can continue to support the journey that our young people are engaged in. As we close today's virtual policy summit, I want to extend my gratitude to you all for your active participation, your thoughtful contributions, your deep commitment to addressing the racial disparities and disproportionalities faced by our young people in California's child welfare system. I also really want to acknowledge our engaged and resilient youth. They are the ones who we do this work for, to support, but they are also the ones whose lives we are impacting every day by our actions. Throughout our discussion, we've examined how youth of color experience greater barriers from their initial entry into the child welfare system through to their exit. We'd heard from Kalia, who has lived experience in the system, about what is needed to help create a more responsive system for transition-aged youth. We've acknowledged the challenge that young people face: limited access to vital services, a lack of tailored supports, and harmful societal perceptions that too often define them by their circumstances rather than by their potential. These disparities are among the challenges we must all collectively address, and we know that without targeted supports, without targeted policy and practice change, the future will continue to remain at risk. Today has been about solutions, again, actionable solutions. Through the breakout sessions, we had the opportunity to dive deeply into 3 of our key themes in our report, and we explored how to dismantle some of the systemic inequities that prevent our transition-aged youth from thriving. Your insights and contributions have been invaluable, particularly in conversation, in the breakouts, the notes on the Padlets. We'll take all of that back, and we will engage in collectively taking action. As we move forward, I do want to highlight some next steps. First, the Alliance is committed to engaging with policymakers and stakeholders across the state to advance these recommendations and urge your commitment. We know that improving outcomes for transition-age youth, particularly youth of color, will require not only incremental change, but systemic transformation. Our aim is to ensure that every young person leaving the child welfare system has the support they need for a successful transition to adulthood. So we need to keep the momentum going from today. As Javon said, how will you show up? We can't allow today's conversation to be a one-time event. We need to continue working together to push meaningful policy change, advocate for better services, and shift the narrative for our transition-age youth. We urge you to read the whole report, commit to recommendations that you can take action on, where you can be a leader in policy and practice change, and share our report with your networks so we're building our reform team. As we close, I want to acknowledge again everyone's commitment to this important work. I want to take us back to something that Kalia said. A supportive community is vital to healing and trust. And we're all part of that larger supportive community. The work ahead is challenging. No reform is without steps and stumbles, but there is a path forward. Today, we've shown that we're not in this effort alone. By continuing to collaborate, advocate, and act, we can make lasting impacts on the lives of our young people in and exiting the foster care system in California. Again, we appreciate your thoughtful participation, your commitment to our youth in foster care. Sarah will send a copy of the PowerPoint presentation today, as well as the recommendations in the report. And we'll encourage you again to review that, to lead where you see a role for yourselves and your agency as well. We appreciate you continuing to engage with us as we move this reform effort forward. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you and the work that you do.
Thanks all.